And there you have an earth-centered tradition that's talking about a mystical experience. So they do cross over. We UUs practice a liberal religion. We draw from many experiences and teachings over our lifetime. For myself, I can identify in my life when I aligned with almost every one of the sources we listed this morning, and I still bounce around back and forth among them. Each has given me something to inform and refine my belief journey. To develop this morning's topic, I've drawn heavily on several books by authors Eugene D. Achille, Andrew Newberg, Mark Waldman, and Mario Beauregard. In these 4 books, all on the subject of mysticism and the brain, these authors suggest that our brains are hardwired to seek answers from many sources, mystical experience being just one of them. They further believe that if the brain doesn't have an answer, it will create one. They describe this phenomenon as neurotheology. Our brains demand that we construct myths to explain our world. The reason for this is that as long as there remain unanswerable questions, the cognitive operators in the brain necessarily perform their functions, even if they must generate myths, gods, demons, or other power sources to do so. Hence, neurotheology came into being. So just what is a mystical experience? To begin our definition, mysticism, I draw from the late UU minister, Reverend Jacob Trapp. He states, "I like to think of mysticism as the art of meeting reality, or the art of richer and deeper awareness. It is an experience that comes unbidden, a very special experience of that oneness, a rare and wonderful realization of what always is, but of which we are seldom aware, flooding in to overwhelm the illusion of aloneness, separateness. There are moments when life seems vivid and resplendent, when a more than mortal splendor breaks in, when there is a touch of grandeur and of glory in just being alive. In our experience of those moments when we're rapturously one with the wonder of all that is, we have some indication of what has been meant by a mystic experience." So that's what Reverend Trapp has to say about mystical experience. Now, what does Wikipedia describe mystical experience to be? The word mysticism comes from the Greek relating to the word mystery. It is the pursuit of achieving union or identity with or conscious awareness of ultimate reality, the divine, spiritual truth, or God through direct experience, intuition, or insight, and the belief that such experience is an important source of knowledge, understanding, and wisdom. A common theme in mysticism is that the mystic and all of reality are one. The purpose of mystical practices is to achieve that oneness in experience, to transcend our limited identity, and to re-identify with all that is. The term mysticism has often been used pejoratively to dismiss sloppy or superstitious thinking, and freely employed as a term of contempt by those who criticize religious sentimentality and bad metaphysics. Today, we are focusing on a more respected variety of mysticism and the brain science research that is behind it. In a National Opinion Research Center study, participants were asked, "Have you ever felt as though you were close to a spiritual force that seemed to lift you out of yourself?" In response to this question, 40% reported having such an experience, and over half of those reported having had multiple experiences of that type. Mystical experiences are defined along a continuum. If you have ever felt lost yourself in a beautiful piece of music, felt swept away by an inspirational speech, zoned out doing something that you really enjoy, You've tasted in a small but revealing way the essence of mystical union. If you have ever been wonderstruck by the beauty of nature or felt a strong emotional connection with all the people around you, perhaps here in this room at this moment, you have held in your mind a mystical experience, and you know how it feels when your ego slips away for a dazzling moment or two, and you understand that you are part of something larger, a oneness with all that exists. As we move up this continuum, our separateness becomes less and less distinct. These experiences are made possible by a neurological function resulting from the softening of the self and absorption of the self into some larger sense of reality that we believe occurs when the brain's orientation area is deprived of neural input. This happens when the one part of the brain deprives other parts of the brain of neural signals. When we have these experiences of knowing, of unity, and we can't say how or why, perhaps even find it hard to find words to describe the experience, they remain with us and add to our understanding of the world and our existence. Neurologists suggest that our difficulty describing these events may stem from the lack of involvement of the brain's language centers, because neural input has been restricted when we are having these mystical experiences. Unlike hallucinations or events resulting from dysfunctional mental health delusional disorders, which are more often frightening and many times not long remembered, mystical events have been described as real, pleasant, blissful, ecstatic, joyful, calming, peaceful, and vividly remembered, even when language is deficient in describing them. Mystical experiences are ways we tell ourselves something, gain insight, find meaning, connect with, and become one of that which is greater than ourselves. There are also reports of spontaneous mystical events, not directly related to meditation or ritual, such as seeing visions, hearing voices. While these spontaneous experiences frequently have a lasting effect on a person's life, such as being born again, these are not the types of mystical events that we are talking about today. Rather, we will be focusing on experiences resulting from meditative practices, as those are ones where the brain function has been scientifically measured in controlled research studies. So to depart and talk a little bit about what has been my own mystical experience. I personally practice a type of meditation called ascension. It is structured and has ritual built into it, but requires no belief in a supreme being. Each practitioner of ascension chooses a focus or an entity that represents the source of all goodness for that person, but it can have no negative connotation. It could be nature, beauty, the stars, the goddess, the ocean, the universe, God, the divine. Each person chooses. I personally chose the word source, which gives me much latitude. To practice ascension, I close my eyes, quiet my mind, drop in an attitude focused on gratitude, appreciation, love, or compassion. Imagine a drop of water falling onto a much larger body of water that ripples flowing out from the center to eternity. There is no attempt to stop thinking or remove thoughts or direct any thoughts, but rather let the thoughts float through my mind like a leaf on a mild breeze, while continuing to reintroduce attitudes of appreciation, gratitude, love, and compassion. Giving no attention to these thoughts as they float by keeps the calming process intact. It is a very simple process that requires no effort. I have found this practice gives me a sense of peace. It may sound trite, but it is the peace that passes all understanding. I began this practice about 4 years ago when my life transitioned. I became a widow, which is a word that still comes hard off of my tongue, and had recently retired from a 40-year business career. Since I have no children, the two most significant focuses of my life were substantially diminished. I found myself faced with a blank canvas that would become the final 20 to 30 years of my life, and I needed something to help me connect with that inner knowing. Several people at that time suggested that I consider practicing ascension. Something that I can't accurately describe with words helped me know that this practice would give me the direction and peace that I was searching for, and it has. My mystical experience presents itself largely as a presence, a feeling, a knowing which I can't explain. I have seen colorful displays in my mind. At its peak, there is a sense of being connected to all that is, no sensation of separateness or of time or space. Ascension always brings that peaceful, calming feeling, but the peak experience of oneness is not something I can make happen, but rather be open to it when it occurs. A little over a year ago, I attended a silent yoga nidra retreat in Boise, Idaho, for a long weekend with about 20 people from all over the United States and Canada. Yoga nidra is a form of meditation in which a person maintains conscious awareness while remaining in a state of complete relaxation and connectedness with all their surroundings. Now, I only knew one other person at this retreat and was somewhat anxious about not talking for a whole weekend. But it turned out to be quite nice not to be expected to say something. Some of you who know me might understand why not talking for a full weekend presented a special challenge. I found that the silence of my voice also quieted my mind in a way that I wasn't expecting. During the weekend, we chanted, meditated, did yoga, read some poetry. Also, during the intense meditations of the weekend, I felt that I was part of everything around me, the people, the trees, the sky. Yes, I was still in my body, but the surroundings felt as if they were a part of me and me of them also. The light seemed more brilliant than usual, and I tried to describe the experience this morning, and my attempt seemed so inadequate, even though the experience is still very vivid in my mind. So what does brain science tell us about having had these mystical experiences? To start, though, I need to offer a few disclaimers. I am not a neuro anything. I'm not a neurologist, a neurobiologist, a neurophysiologist, a neuroscientist. In fact, before this talk, I didn't even know all those people existed. I am an observer of science, but don't consider myself a practicing scientist. So what I'm about to share with you today is gathered from knowledgeable sources, interpreted and communicated as best I can in layman's language, so as to be understandable, I hope. Feel free to tell me later if we've achieved that goal together. A typical brain weighs 3.5 pounds, contains 100 billion cells, almost as numerous as the stars in the Milky Way galaxy. And each cell is linked by synapses to as many as 100,000 other cells. The synapses between cells are awash in hormones and neurotransmitters that modulate the transmission of neural signals. The synapses constantly form and dissolve, weaken and strengthen, and modulate the transmission of these signals. The synapses, in their weakening and strengthening, they are constantly activating new experiences. Does it make you weary to think that all this is going on behind your eyeballs this very minute? For today's thoughts, consider the brain to be our personal computer, our guiding machine executing commands to gather and process data, and the mind being the result of those commands. Thoughts, concepts, emotions, outputs. So the brain makes the mind. I may use the words interchangeably for ease in describing brain-mind work. The conclusions from the brain-mind studies that I'm sharing resulted from two sources. The first being medical examinations of brains from individuals who'd suffered a brain injury, epilepsy, stroke, some medical condition that changed the nature of the brain. And the second source is studies in which the brain was monitored before, after, and/or during meditative states. These studies measured changes in blood chemistry and also blood flow in the brain, and recorded areas of the brain that were involved when meditative states were taking place. The research also recorded permanent changes to the brain from repeated meditative states. And the measurement technologies that they used to do this were a variety of types of scans: CT, PET, MRI, functional MRI, and SPECT scans. There is currently one of these spirituality and the brain studies being conducted right here at UNM, and some of our members are participating in that study. My Ascension teacher also participated in a study of this type in Seattle, and practitioners of the study were very surprised to see the state of her brain after years of meditation. The documented studies have discovered that there are key sections of the brain that play a significant role in transcendence. The first is the orientation area of the brain. It's a part of the brain that helps us distinguish ourselves from the rest of the world and the space around us. This process requires a constant stream of sensory input to do its job. This area of the brain is also capable of controlling the flow of neural input to other parts of the brain. The second major area involved is the limbic system. It's often known as the emotional center of the brain and is sometimes referred to as the transmitter to God. Electrical stimulation to the limbic structures produces dreamlike states, out-of-body sensations, illusions, déjà vu, all of which have been reported during spiritual states. The authors believe that all mystical experiences, from the mildest to the most intense, have their roots in the mind's machinery of transcendence, these two areas that we just talked about, the orientation association area and the limbic system. These experiences are heavily dependent on the involvement of the higher cognitive structures, especially the frontal lobe and other association areas of the brain. Spiritual practices have measurable effect on neurotransmitters, the chemicals that make our brains and bodies work. Individuals practicing yoga nidra, a particularly calm type of yoga, experienced a 65% increase in the presence of dopamine. Now, dopamine heightens sensory imagery, generates pleasurable experiences, stimulates positive thoughts, and increases the overall sense of well-being. The ability to believe in spiritual realms may be dependent on the amount of dopamine that is released in the frontal lobe of the brain. Two of the authors, Newberg and Akili, describe two different activity levels where brain changes can be observed. One is a very active, fast, rhythmic activity, like dancing or running, and the other a quiet, passive, meditative state. More research results are available for the quiet, passive practices because it's much easier and more effective to measure someone when they're in a resting state. Today, our focus will be on those passive, meditative states. And these passive practices include meditation, controlled breathing, chanting, prayer, all ritualistic states that take the mind to a quiet place. The authors suggest that both active and passive practices can take the mind to this same state of change, but especially in the passive meditative states, they've had the effect of contributing to the mystical experience. Both practices result in a quiescent state, which leads to what they call a breakthrough or a spillover, an overload of neural input from one brain hemisphere to the other. As a result of this neurological spillover or breakthrough, it can lead to intensely altered states of consciousness. Breakthrough or spillover is a series of rapid firing, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, left to right to left, back and forth until the brain hemispheres are so flooded with neural input that the orientation association area restricts further neural input to the left hemisphere. Now remember, the left hemisphere is where we define ourselves and where our language center resides. So restricting this neural input to the left hemisphere diminishes our sense of self. It blurs it. And the right hemisphere at that point attempts to fill this void. It tries to create a space for this self-definition to exist. But since it has limited input, neural input to do this job, the self becomes diminished and softened, producing a sensation of connection with all that is, that sense of oneness we've been describing. It is also in the left hemisphere that the dominant verbal language center is located, hence the difficulty describing the experience after it occurs. So now in closing, the connection between neurotheology and religious theology. These brain-mind activities and the transcendent states they produce are not religious in any formal sense, but in neurological terms, they are similar to many unitary states of consciousness. They are similar to experiences produced by religious activity. Religious activities also exist along the same neurological continuum. And like non-spiritual unitary states, their intensity is determined by the degree to which the orientation area of the brain is restricting that neural flow to the left hemisphere. Albert Einstein seemed to have some understanding of this in a religious sense well before all this neurological research existed. He said, "The religion of the future will be a cosmic religion. It should transcend definitions of God and avoid dogmas and theology. Covering both the natural and the spiritual, it should be based on a religious sense arising from the experience of all things as a meaningful unity." May it be so.